and several other major maritime neighbours close by. So while Australia's own small population and large landmass present their own challenges to defence and security planners, in terms of complexity, China's situation is another dimension to our own. And we should always bear this in mind when we make judgments about China's strategic choices. A part and parcel of China's reform and opening has been its increasing engagement with the wider world, to the point where it is now a major player in the globalization process. Two of the biggest changes in the way in which China has done its foreign policy over the last decade or more have been the stress given to multilateral diplomacy and the importance of resources and energy. But China has become an increasingly adept multilateral player, from a loner to a joiner. It's increasingly active in the debate and discussion about regional architecture, and when Henry's finished his honours thesis, we'll know more about that than we do now. And this, of course, provides it with more opportunities to move agendas in its own interests, but also provides others with opportunities to engage positively and draw China into constructive relations with the international community, the sort of thing that Robert Zellick was talking about with his responsible stakeholder ideas. China's 2008 white paper on diplomacy described energy security as a major centerpiece of China's foreign policy for the first time. China is the world's second largest producer and consumer of global energy. It's an indispensable part of the global energy market, an indispensable part of the solution to global warming, if there's to be one. I should point out that Australia is the world's biggest exporter of coal, and China is the world's biggest importer of coal. So we're co-criminals, if you like, in this issue. And so this is taking Australia into areas, China into areas literally and metaphorically, where it's traditionally had little interest and less experience. And some of this is positive. The Australian economy would be in a sorry state if China didn't want our resources. Some less so. Think of the issues arising out of Darfur and the Sudan in the last couple of years. But to be fair, we should also acknowledge that China has modified some aspects of its behaviour, is conscious of accusations of neo-colonialism in Africa, has played some role in seeking constructive solutions, and where UN peacekeeping is concerned, this is 55 personnel in 12 locations. It's the 14th largest global contributor to UN peacekeeping, and unlike Japan, China does not have a problem putting its personnel into harm's way, and unfortunately a number of Chinese peacekeepers have given their lives in this important cause. Now, the impact of the financial crisis, it's clear that China has come through better than most. And if it were not so, we in Australia would certainly be in trouble. But there are some new considerations, including the following. Since the 19th century, China has sought wealth and power. Over the last 20 years, at least, wealth and power have mostly been exemplified by the United States. So China has calculated that it needs at least 20 years of peace and cooperation with the US while it catches up. And people in the West have calculated that they have about that amount of time in which to bring China into the sort of global community that suits us and suits our interests. But now Iraq and Afghanistan have shown the limitations of US power, and the global financial crisis with its origin in that subprime loans crisis in the US has done the same for US wealth. So there are those in China who are beginning to question the basis of China's relatively compliant behaviour vis-à-vis the West, and particularly the US. Now this is not yet and may not become mainstream thinking in China, but it's food for thought, and there certainly is an important debate going on in China about how powerful is the United States, how long is the United States going to remain number one. So that should also be food for us. The window we thought we had may not be open for as long as originally predicted. Other new elements impacting on China's foreign policy making include nationalistic popular opinion, including in particular that expressed by angry netizens, the famous Fenqing. Although one thing about Fenqing is they do grow older like everybody else. But some years back, Chen Qichen was asked by a student at Beida what he thought was the greatest contradiction in Chinese foreign policy, and he replied that between China's rational policies and popular opinion. Now, this can be overstated, and sometimes Chinese embassies use this as an all too facile excuse for policies that embarrass the more intelligent of them. We had some problems in this regard in Australia last year with the Rigby visit and film, but it is an issue in a way which was not the case previously. Chinese policymakers, and not just foreign policymakers, do have to take into account public opinion. You should look at the way public opinion concerns play their part in the way in which the Chinese government is handling the current kerfuffle with Japan over the Diaoyu Islands issue. Another relatively new issue, which Jill has already mentioned, is China's interest in soft power and the impact of international reputation on China's global standing. A third new development is the beginnings of a reinterpretation of the time-honoured doctrine of non-interference in the affairs of other countries. When you see Chinese foreign policy scholars talking about proactive non-interference, you realise something's going on. What's going on, of course, is that China is discovering that as it acquires great power status, it's having to take on a series of new responsibilities. Life becomes more complicated, and the expectations of others, as well as one's own people, also rise. All this means it's no longer feasible to treat the domestic and international as two totally different arenas. So globalization and China's increasing presence mean that just as international developments impact on China's domestic situation, so domestic developments in China are of increasing importance internationally. And there's another complicated issue, that China's foreign policy is becoming, well, more complicated. By which I mean that there are more players and the various lines of decision-making and authority are increasingly unpredictable. Not that it was ever all that clear, but it's less so now as Chinese society becomes less monolithic, different interest groups emerge, the power of the central government to impose a clear and consistent policy line is not what it was. I'm talking here about groups such as powerful central ministries, for instance the Ministry of Commerce versus the Ministry of Finance and the People's Bank of China on the subject of the revaluation of the yuan, state-owned enterprises, for instance in Iran, the nuclear industry, for instance pressure for a new reactor for Pakistan, the PLA, a series of statements over the past year from fairly senior PLA figures that are clearly out of sync, at least with some of the things the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been saying. Powerful local governments, Chinese netizens again, and so on. So if things go wrong, don't necessarily blame the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, although I have to say that their public statements don't always help, and perhaps sometimes amount even to a form of counter-soft power. There are always going to be issues between the message you convey to your own people and the message you convey overseas, and sometimes messages which are designed to meet domestic interests are reinterpreted in a different way overseas. This is something that all foreign ministries have to come to grips with. I suggest that China maybe have to go, it's got a little way to go. More than ever though, in order to judge how China is going to behave internationally, we need to know as much as possible about what's happening domestically. Of course, it's crucial to follow closely the evolution of strategic and foreign policy thinking, trade and investment policies, China's position on climate change and so on. But these things don't occur in a vacuum. Less than ever before, because China is developing so rapidly. Less than ever before can we afford to ignore the official and unofficial debates and struggles that characterize China today. And beneath the surface appearance of harmony and united purpose, China is the scene of great intellectual ferment and contention, both within and without the confines of the party. And frankly, some of the most interesting debates are going on within the party. Something again which some foreign observers tend to neglect. As I've said, almost all thinking Chinese uphold the classic wealth and power goals that date back to at least back to the Yang Wu self-strengthening movement in the mid-19th century. But how you define them, how you get there, what you do when you get there, if you get there, these are all open to question. And while some at the top might like to try to keep things as they are, just about all Chinese I know at least agree that while they don't know exactly what China is going to look like in 20 or 30 years from now, they're pretty sure it's going to be different, at least as different as China today is from China 30 years ago. Interestingly, that makes China rather different from India, where most people who look at India expect that it will be pretty much the same sort of country as it is now. And that actually has an impact on foreign perceptions. The question is not just about the rise of China, but what sort of a China. So debates about democracy and political reform, reappraisals of China's own history, the remarkable revival of China's own, of interest in China's own classical tradition with all its ambiguities, partly but by no means exclusively encouraged by the state, the religious revival of Christianity, but still more strikingly of Buddhism, the growth of environmental consciousness, the emergence of at times virulent nationalism, all these things and more need to be factored into how we think about the implications